Welcome to the Momnificent Podcast. This is the place where we help parents live a happy, healthy life with their kids. We're going to show you how to connect with your child and help them even in their most difficult moments as we hear from experts in the field. I'm your host, Dr. Karin Jakubowski, an international speaker, public school principal, and former struggling student. The Momnificent Podcast equips parents with science-based strategies to help you live a happy, healthy life with your kids. Welcome. On this week's episode, I have Emily Ewin with me. She's a special ed teacher in Maryland, and she just completed her master's degree. Through a recent research project, she created an opportunity for her student voices to be heard. And what's powerful about this is that what our students are thinking and their perspective can help us be better teachers and really help support each student. If you know a teacher, I would love it if you would take the opportunity to just pass this episode on to them.
Okay, so help our audience with, I'm going to let you tell us what you want the audience to know about you. Like, it's one thing that for on the show, I usually am like, and here's Emily Ewin, and she's done this. And today I was like, you know what? I heard it on a recent podcast. A host did it. And I was like, oh, I like that. I'm going to try it. So you're my first try.
Okay.
So tell, what do you want our audience to know about you? What are things you love? You just mentioned a few things, but what do you do? And then what do you like to do in your free time?
Yeah. My name is Emily Ewin. I live in the Eastern Shore of Maryland. I don't know why I always talk about the Eastern Shore, but I just think I'm really proud of this area. The community down here is like no other, and I just think it's a part of me. So I always like to talk about that. I'm a teacher. I've been a teacher for 4 years, and I just graduated from University of Delaware with my Master's of Leadership and Disability Services. And when people, I think what's really important that I need to start being more proud of and taking more time to explain is what I did for 4 years. Because when I say teacher, people think elementary school teacher, or they think when I say middle school, they just think of math or science. And that's not what I did. And I think people really need to know more about what I did, which was work with students who have emotional disabilities. So a student who has an emotional disability may not necessarily have been born with a disability. You can be born with an emotional disability based off imbalances in your brain, but also if a child at a certain ages undergoes trauma, that impacts their ability to process their own emotions, process others' emotions, and process things around them. So I think the 4 years that I've taught, it has really impacted who I am as a person. I've noticed I'm a lot more patient. I listen. When I was in college and as a kid, I would talk nonstop and people couldn't get a word in. And I noticed now, coming into the beginning of my 30s, I'm a lot more quiet and I'm a lot more introverted and just like to listen first before I necessarily say something, which I think my career has really impacted that, because in order to get to know my students, I have to become a better listener. So.
And you recently finished a study that you did, mocking a couple other studies that you had mentioned on an earlier call. And before you kind of dive into what that kind of research told you about being an educator, and I was mentioning your presentation to a fellow special ed parent teacher, and they were like, wait, what did she say? I want to hear it. I want to see it. So that's why I was like, wait, let me call Emily up and see if she'll come on my podcast so I can share it and show it for those of out there who are interested in this area and this topic. But what's one thing you would say maybe to a teacher or educator listening that, like everybody did, had a tough year, and in dealing with students with severe and intense complex needs and emotional needs, what if some of them just feel a little burnt out? What's a tip or a tool or a thought maybe that will help inspire or pick them up or lift them up today, would you say?
I think that one thing that me and my colleagues would talk about throughout this year is that we're all burnt out, but so are the students. And And sometimes you just have to remind yourself that like your words are what like students look forward to, and how you say something can impact your day and their day. So like, for example, like one thing that was really embarrassing about this year that I really regret, but like, I think it just really sums up what I just said is I was in charge of our bus, not in charge, but I was one of our bus ramp attendees this year. And in Maryland, the kids all had to be 6 feet apart, you know, masks on, and we were approached to be very strict about it. And after week 2 of telling the same students to, you know, get, you know, space out, please, space out. Hey, can you put your face mask on correctly? Week 2, I had lost my temper and was like getting very like, hey, like I've already told you, and you know, already started being more totalitarian. And I noticed like throughout my day, like my mood was completely off. And one of my students, who her and I have a really good relationship, she'd be like, why are you cranky? And she would call me out on it. And I was like, I don't know why I'm cranky. I had a good mood. I had my coffee. Like I worked out this morning. Like, why am I so angry besides having this mask on? And I realized it was how I was interacting too with these students. And so like, I noticed that and I was like, okay, cool. Like we're going to try this differently. So I stopped reminding them about the masks, and I stopped telling them to get 6 feet apart, but I did it in a different way. So like when kids were not doing the rule, like following the rules, I just went up to them and I was like, how are you guys doing? What's going on? And just my presence, like they quickly put the mask on without me saying it. So I thought that was really interesting because I didn't really need to remind them of the rule. I feel like they just also wanted that attention and wanted, you know, somebody to talk to them. And then I noticed my mood was better. And my student, she's like, wow, like you're happy today. And, you know, and my students online were like, noticed it too. And I was like, wow, just me talking differently to the kids and not necessarily getting upset over them not following the rules, like it affects so many people and throughout the school day.
That is so huge. So 2 things you said reminded me of something I literally just read. How if a educator or teacher treats their child and just talks with them in a mindful way, like actually showing that they care about what the child is saying, looking at them in the eye, nodding their head, like that whole listening, you know, body involved approach. They actually did a study with kids, a teacher just talking at them straight at them and not really connecting in those subtle cue ways, right? And the kids who had the mindful teacher, if you will, they actually felt so much more like engaged and warm and cared for it. And that person, like, I mean something to that person. And it's just those little subtle nuances that you're talking about that are just like, wow, that is so cool that you noticed that and you tried it and it actually gave you the same approach that you wanted, even though it was like different, and you felt better afterwards, right? And you got the result they wanted, and they felt like you were, you know, connected with them. And then the other thing I just read in a Principal magazine, they just sent an article out, was how like give the kids this summer to just totally have fun and decompress because they're stressed and they had the most difficult year. And as much as we are saying that as adults, like the kids had the most difficult and things they missed out on, and the birthday parties they couldn't attend and things like that. So it was just like, hey, just recognize how hard this has been for the kids and just let them enjoy. They have to go through almost like that grieving process to like get to the other side. So that was really cool that you shared both of those things.
Yeah. I think the grieving process is like huge.
Yeah.
Like kids, like especially middle school age, and like, you know, the fourth, fifth graders, they're fully aware what they missed. Especially if they have older siblings that got to experience something, and that was like, you know, the mild marker that they were looking for, and it got ripped away from them. Like that can impact so much of like how they interact with their peers, with staff members, with parents, like.
Yeah, and be feeling bitter. Like the kids last year who didn't have the graduation, or for us, the move up ceremony in 5th grade. And this year we had it in person. And, you know, so those students a year older, just looking back and dealing with the feeling of that's not fair. And that can have a bitterness settle in, which, you know, we all know isn't healthy for your function, your body, health in so many areas.
Absolutely.
Tell us about, so what got you, tell us about your study that you did and maybe what prompted you to go down that avenue.
Yeah. So I taught for 2 years, and then I decided it was time to go back to do my master's, just because I had the skills, and a lot of my coworkers who had started families expressed how hard it was, and I was like, all right, it's time to go. It's time to do this. And I chose the master's at Delaware because it worked with 3 schools. So it was with the School of Education, but it also worked with the School of Business and the School of Health Science. And one thing of working with students who have emotional disabilities, they have a lot of outside services, such as, counseling. And then, sometimes some of my students had to go away to different facilities, maybe across the Bay Bridge or up towards Wilmington, Delaware. And as an educator, you don't, at least in my undergrad and a lot of other educators I talk to, you don't really learn about those services and how to work together. Because a lot of times we're all trying to cook the same pie. One of my colleagues at UD talked, we're all trying to cook the same pie, but none of us are talking. And one person has the cherries, the other person has the bread, and we're all like connected, but we're not putting it together, and therefore the pie is gross, or it's not like the best thing that you can have. So I chose this master's because of like, after like learning about the services and trying to talk to like some of the service providers my students had outside of school, I was like, cool, this master's gonna like prep me to like, know what to ask, know what these services look like, and see what they're doing. So my colleagues and I, we were talking at UD, and like some of them, provided counseling services and different types. One of my colleagues worked at a community college for students with disabilities to like prep, like not IEPs, but something similar to help them be successful at the community college. And immediately they asked what I did, and I started talking about students with emotional disabilities. And all these people that worked in these outside services were like, yeah, if you have an emotional disability, you're not going anywhere. And it hit me really hard because I was like, yeah, I mean, what? Like, what do you mean? And my one colleague at the community college was like, yes, I've had a couple students that have trauma and emotional disabilities, and they don't graduate, or they don't, they come to a class and then they're done. And so I started talking to my advisor and my capstone. And originally what my capstone was supposed to be, because of my experience working with students with emotional disabilities, was I was going to make a toolkit for general educators on, how to approach these students and different strategies that work, research-based strategies. And, there's certain research-based strategies out with for students who have autism, to cover the lights. And I was like, cool, there has to be something out there how to approach students with emotional disabilities that like more people can be like in their toolbox and in their heads. So I started looking and researching and spent hours, and I couldn't find any research that was replicated. I found, a couple articles, like 2 articles about how they brought dogs into a classroom and how it helped students with emotional disabilities reading level come up. I found like all this random stuff, but I didn't find anything that was concrete, and it was really sad. And the only thing that was concrete over these like probably like over 80 articles that I read was that teachers burn out, that, hold on, I have some of my notes right here, that, they end up going to jail. Half of them don't graduate high school. And all these things that like, if you have this label that you're probably going to face. And then I started thinking of some of my students that are now in high school that aren't doing well. And I'm like, wow, they're following the same stigma. And it really just like, I was like, why doesn't anyone care? Why hasn't this really been brought to anyone's attention? So after reading all of these articles, I think like the biggest article that like was crazy to me was this one study. It was specifically about inclusion of students with ED. So putting ED students into general education settings, in the elementary setting, the middle school setting, and the high school setting. And what they did was they did a scoping review. So they pulled like all these articles and really tried to see if like there was any themes or commonalities between this research. And basically they started with 7,416 manuscripts, and they only met 30 that met the criteria of what they were looking for. And which was like out of 7,000 articles, only 30 were about specifically students with emotional disabilities and trauma. And this inclusion of students with ED, this was conducted in 2019. So it wasn't that long ago that the scoping review was done. This article acknowledged that this was the first scoping review that had ever been done really in an educational setting, because they didn't really acknowledge why it was the first one, but they just said this was the first one, and hopefully more people would dive into this research. It does take a lot of time to do a scoping review, to read that many manuscripts and see the commonalities. But the themes like suggested that there isn't sufficient evidence to show where students with emotional disabilities learn best. There's not enough evidence to show that like putting them in general education is the best, or putting them in self-contained, which is what I teach. And I like that got my brain going, because when they're in middle school and they're in self-contained, I teach them ELA, which is language arts, English. I teach them math, social studies, and science, which I'm not certified in those areas.
It's like an elementary school teacher.
Yeah. And so, and at some point in times, like I would have 6th graders and 8th graders in my block for ELA, all ranging from like, I would do testing on them to make sure to see what their reading level would be, ranging from, I one time had a classroom of 5, ranging from a pre-K level to a reading level comprehension.
Middle school students. Wow.
And that's not fair to that's not fair to me. Like
differentiation guru. It's easier said than done.
Yeah, like, you know, differentiating, sorry, is great, but there's only so much you can do, you know, with your time and like grouping and your help. So I was just like, you know, that was crazy to me that there's no research proving what the best area is for these kids.
Wow.
It did mention that one thing they found amongst the 30 articles is that offering choice was effective in increasing student engagement. And that's something I use in my classroom a lot. And when I gave my presentation, I actually conducted a student interview with one of my students and explained to her what I was doing. She knew I was getting my master's, and she was really excited to be a part of that. In the article, it mentioned that offering choices was effective in increasing student task engagement. And throughout my research, like that's really like the only main research strategy I found that was proven to work with students with emotional disabilities. And that's what my student talked about, is that I give her 2 choices and give her time. So, you know, if she comes in and she is displaying not in the best mindset, and I'm like, and I just say, hey, you know, I would like you to get on task. But if you don't want to get on task, would you like a 5-minute break or a 10-minute break? And she really talked about that really like felt like she had control, because there's so many things in life that she can't control in her family. And going back to what we talked about earlier with, you know, talking about like the masks and like getting angry, she really talked about like that if a student isn't following a rule, like ask them why, and avoid giving them authoritative directions. And this student, I worked with her for 2 years, and my first year, she like was not open with me. She was very, yes, no, leave me alone. Okay, yeah, I want that, thank you. And it was really neat because when we were doing this interview, it was more like you and I talking. I felt like I was talking to an adult. I didn't even prompt her. She just started talking about her 6th grade experience when she was in gen ed, because she started in general ed in the middle of her 6th grade year, got pulled back to my class. And she's like, you know how we have lockers? I said, yeah, I do. And she she's like, I hated being in gen ed because all the teachers would just yell at me to put my backpack in my locker. And I said, oh, well, why didn't you want to put your backpack in the locker? And she said, in elementary school, I have had my stuff stolen before. And she's like, you know, like a lot of my stuff, Miss Ewin, like I pay for my own stuff. And, you know, we don't have a lot at home, and I couldn't, like, I don't want my stuff to get stolen again. And she said, I know, like, you have the lock on the locker, but like people are really smart. She's like, I know how to get those locks undone. I just like didn't mean to laugh, but I was like, okay. And she expressed that, you know, I think it was like one day right before she got into a physical altercation, one teacher just kept pressing her, and she responded very negatively to this teacher, and, you know, went into verbal aggression, cussing, and then immediately she was looked at as a bad kid because she engaged in this behavior, when really she's not. And she has a very, like, in my opinion, a very valid reason to feel this way of why she doesn't want to put her backpack in the locker, but she couldn't express that. And she said, she's like, really, if somebody just would have asked me why I don't want to have it in my locker, I probably would have told them, but nobody asked. People just told.
I think that is so critical, because it's something that I've learned over the years to say to kids. Start with, I noticed, or I heard, like, I noticed you're keeping your backpack and the expectation is it to be in your locker. And then you ask this magic question that I swear they're going to put on a shirt for me when I retire. What's up with that? And you don't use a talking down tone of voice. It's very empathetic and just open-ended. And like they say, it's like talking to someone on the elevator. Hey, how you doing today? Like, what's up with that? And the kids actually tell you what's really going on. I mean, eventually some of the younger kids, it's harder, but that would have been the perfect setup for her to just explain, for the teacher to have more understanding, which after I shared this with the parent, they were like, it's like seeking for us to understand. And I'm like, yes. So when you shared that, I was like, this is so powerful. This is such a good reminder for us.
Yeah. And like, I think that's one thing that, and like, when I say teachers, I mean myself too. Like, we just need to be more open to hearing this. Because I know that, like, the workload is crazy. And I know that, you know, like, the stress level is so high. And the last thing that somebody wants to hear is that they're not being kind. And that's like one thing, like, when some of my coworkers at school, like, would come to me for advice, and I would like initially bring this up a certain way, it wasn't perceived well because they interpret it that I wasn't calling them a kind teacher. And that's not it at all. And I say it because, like, even I'm caught being authoritative sometimes. It's something that, you know, we're just like, oh, we already told that kid 10 times, like.
And it's hard not to take it personally.
Yes.
I've told them and they aren't. And then you get frustrated. And then when you take it personally, then when you try to do this approach, it's like, there's no way I'm thinking of it, saying it that way to the kid, or there's no way I'm going to give them a choice, because you're so, you know, emotionally tied to that situation and what they did that really bothered you as the adult, a parent or teacher.
Yeah. Well, and you think by giving them options, you don't have control, which, like, I think, like, one of my really good friends, she's an amazing math teacher. If you're listening to me, I'm sorry I'm telling the story. I love you. But she called me the other week all upset because this student wasn't following the directive. And it ended up that she had to call the principal down to get the student physically removed from her class. And when talking and debriefing about it, I was like, well, was the student hurting anyone? No, well, but they just weren't following the rule. And I asked her, I said, you know, did you offer her, like, because after the discussion, she told the student to go to the front office, and the student was like, I'm not leaving my classroom. And then immediately it was the call to go get somebody to escort her out. And I said, well, why didn't you just tell her, hey, I'm going to get you 5 minutes to calm down. I would like you to leave after that 5 minutes. 5 minutes passes, I'm going to have to call the front office, and then you walk away. And she's like, well, then that gives her power. And I'm like, but that's the thing, is that the student thinks she has the power. And you're also giving her time to reflect and make the right choice and still have a relationship with you. Versus like, if you call the front office, you're giving the front office now the power. And that student, you're going to have to rebuild that relationship with that student somehow in your very busy schedule. Because now that student knows that you don't have the power. In order to get her out of the classroom, you're going to have to go call the front office. And those are the people with the real power.
And I really believe down deep inside every, I'll just say human, they really want to do well.
Yes.
That girl really wanted to do what she was supposed to do, to stay in the classroom. She wanted to go to the office if she had the ability in that moment to just digest everything that was going on and be okay with the fact that I have to go to the office now. But it's just really tapping into really and believing that they do want to do well in every interaction that you're having with them.
Yes. Yeah. And giving them control. Like you know, like we were talking about with the masks and COVID and all the trauma, like kids haven't had control at all this year. And giving them two options gives them control, but you dictate the two options. It's things that you can control in your classroom and like you can do.
Yeah, I always say you give them two choices that you're okay with. You have to be okay with either choice they decide. Don't give them two choices that one you're like, oh gosh, I hope they don't pick that. Don't put it on the table.
No, because they'll decide that. They'll pick that.
Give them two options that you're okay with. That's a good point.
Yeah.
And then wasn't there another thing that the kids told you in your interviews that was like a real aha?
Oh, one thing, creating conversations that involve engagement and not just saying, oh, hi, you know, Tommy, hope you're having a good day. Yes, I am. Like one thing that, it's different for every kid, especially because every kid has their own personality and their own needs and they're very individualized. But with this student who I did this interview for, she is now, I'm really proud of her. She is very expressive that her emotions change like weather. Her emotions range. She said, you know, she feels everything all at once, all at nothing. Sometimes it changes through the day really fast. And every day when she got off the bus, I would ask her, I'm like, hey, what are you, a 1 to 5? And it also gave her the opportunity. She could hold up a hand and not talk at all, or she can use her voice. Another choice, feeling that she has control of the situation. And when she wouldn't respond, I would be like, hey, I need this information for me because I can't read your mind. And I have to know and plan like which type of crazy to be for you today. And like, she would always like, be like, okay, cool. And immediately like throw up a 2. And I'd be like, all right, cool. Like, and, you know, I know 2 meant more options, more, you know, this, whereas like a 5 meant that whatever I have planned that day, it's going to be perfect. And I'm not going to have to really modify it. So, and she expressed that when teachers did that, like it created more of a trust and a respect, and she felt obligated to do the work. She felt obligated to be engaged. She felt obligated to show up. When the student was in gen ed, she specifically had one teacher that she loved, and she talked about him during this interview and saying that like she felt that he cared because he wanted to know her as a human. And that was a quote. Like she's like, he cared about me on a human level, not a teacher student level, which for her, she meant that like sometimes she feels like teachers like are like, oh, like what did she say exactly? She expressed that like she like sometimes felt talked down to, like you're the student. Like, she said that like sometimes teachers act like they can't learn anything from me.
That's big.
Mm-hmm.
Big. And that's funny because I just heard this recently, that let a kid teach you something sometimes.
Yes.
Like that's huge for them. That gives them such a sense of like confidence and self-esteem boost, and we get so wrapped up in the test scores and the scores, and I know it drives even, gosh, as a rating as a school, our scores are wrapped up completely into that. And yet kids have actually vocalized, I feel like I'm just being trained for a test score and no one's really caring about who I am as a person. Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. So I love that you're touching on this.
Yeah. And here, I'm going to stop sharing my screen for 1 second so I can go to the right one. But yeah, so like based off like this student's engagement and me reading all of these articles, I decided that I wanted my capstone to be, I wanted to conduct a survey and really like deep, like I wanted to see like people, like teachers' mindsets about these students in the gen ed setting, teachers like me across my county. I teach in Wycomico County in Salisbury. And I really wanted to see like, what are the mindsets that are associated with these students and like some of the techniques that I've talked about. Can you see my screen? Is that okay? Okay. So the research questions I wanted to ask are, what are the current attitudes towards students with emotional disabilities in a general education setting / classroom? What are the same, I wanted the same question, but I really wanted to gear towards outside of the general education setting. So working with teachers like me. What do teachers feel are possible solutions to create positive attitudes towards educating students with emotional disabilities? And do attitudes differ based on experience with working with students who have emotional disabilities? So really quick before I keep on going, I'm gonna kind of do a spoiler alert for the last bullet. When I conducted my survey, I had 40 teachers participate. I was super excited by the sample size and everyone's willingness, but 39 out of the 40 had experience working with students in emotional disabilities in the general education setting or in the self-contained setting. So I wasn't able to address this question, but with that being said, like it just proves that there needs to be more research about students with emotional disabilities and training for teachers on how to respond.
Yeah.
Because everyone that participated except for one person had worked with students with emotional disabilities.
Wow.
They're not, they are everywhere. They're not just,
And there's more and more of them.
Yes.
It's not decreasing, it's just increasing, which could be why there's lack of research, because somehow maybe we didn't identify students with this, diagnosis or disability category as maybe it's just, and that has just grown over the years.
Yes. Yeah. And that's true too. And just being aware of like that, these outbursts aren't bad behaviors as, people look or see them. It is deeper than that.
I like to say, sometimes I say to a kid, you're not bad. What you did or said, the action wasn't expected. But that's a huge difference, because when that kid internalizes that I'm bad because I did X, that's when you see the self-esteem go down. That's where you see the self-confidence dissipate. And it's just I think that's important for teachers to make that distinction, and parents for the kids.
Yeah. Well, and they're going to buy, like, everyone wants to buy into an identity. Especially like I coach girls lacrosse, I coach younger girls, I coach high school, and the girls that think they want to play in college, they buy into that identity and put in the work. Versus like, if one of my girls doesn't think they are good enough to play in college, sometimes that affects their work ethic and how they see themselves. And, and it's crazy when you place them and tell them like, you can go play in college, and they then see that coming, like it completely changes. And it applies to the word bad. If a kid thinks of themselves as bad, they're going to feel okay with going to school, with not participating in your classroom. They're not going to be intrinsically motivated to like succeed, because they're a bad kid. It's okay. I'm a bad kid. I don't have to do those things.
So powerful.
Yeah. So the methods that I used is, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. I said 40, I meant, oops, and it went too fast. It's 30. So 29 out of 30 had to work with students with emotional disabilities. I'm so sorry about that. So in the study, 17 general education teachers participated and 13 special educators. I just put this GIF on here because, as we continue to talk about, everyone's tired, and it's been a very interesting 2020.
Yes, it has.
So materials I used is created a survey from Qualtrics. It involved Likert scale questions and open-ended questions. And what I based my survey on was at Liberty University, they did a survey to compare pre-educators' mindset about working with students with emotional disabilities. So what they did is they had 35 students take a pre-survey and a post-survey. So they took the pre-survey and it asked them similar questions to what I asked the teachers in Wycomico County, such as, wondering about referrals. And if you were just looking at mindset, and then these 35 teachers had to go work with students who have trauma and emotional disabilities at an alternative school for 8 hours. And then after they completed that field placement, they took a post-survey. And it was found throughout this research that after working with students who have this trauma, the teachers' mindsets changed. In the pre-survey, a lot of teachers expressed that they did not want to work with students who had trauma or emotional needs. They were scared. They believed that students who had trauma or emotional disabilities would possibly be lower academically and not have the same academic needs as students with, compared to students without emotional disabilities. And in the post-test, a lot of those mindsets and thoughts completely changed, which I thought was really interesting. So I based my questions based off that. And then after I took the data, I used SPSS, which is a data analysis software, to see what themes and what was statistically significant. And basically, this is what I just talked about, my procedure: created the survey, administered it online, and then analyzed it and ran the independent samples t-test through SPSS. So these are my findings. I did this one informally after giving the survey, and I asked that, do you feel that students with emotional disabilities are often judged by other educators? And 86% of respondents said yes.
Amazing. That is shocking.
Yes.
I think that would be shocking for those teachers to actually see this, because I think it goes back to perception.
Yeah.
We think we are saying or doing something and making someone feel a certain way, but this is alarming.
Yeah. And I was just like blown away. And the 14% said no. And there was a follow-up question to see if open-ended to just explain. And
What they say.
The 14% that said no expressed that all consequences are fair. That was amongst 3 of the responses. And immediately when they went into consequences, I was like, why are we talking about consequences already? Because I don't know, because I didn't ask and I didn't follow up, but if we're already talking about consequences, and consequences are a synonym of bad, and we're already associating bad with emotional disabilities.
Wow.
So I was like, well, you say no, but you are judging them because you're already talking about consequences with it. Which I was a little mind blown, but yeah, 86% saying yes is insane. So the next question was, do you feel that students with emotional disabilities, and this is continued, what I talked about, the ones that say no, that it says teachers do not judge and that consequences are fair, which I mentioned just ago. And then the educators that said yes really talked about the stigma that students with emotional disabilities are dangerous, aggressive, unpredictable. Teachers really fear losing control, which we both, we talked about earlier, and the lack of training and knowledge, and that they're seen as bad kids. The ones that the 86% that said yes, they really touched on bad kids a lot. But with 86% saying yes, I like to think that's a positive thing, because if they acknowledge that they're judging these students, then they're quicker to change that perception.
Right. Yeah.
Minded.
And that's where some maybe awareness and training could come in.
Yes.
Because at the heart and the root and every core of every educator, I do believe that they are there for what's best for kids and they want to make a difference, right? That's why we get into education in the first place. So how do we not get lost in that translation when perceptions are different?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So when I compared settings, and these questions, they were asked on a Likert scale, and the Likert scale was 1 to 6, ranging from agree to, hold on, make sure I'm saying this right. That way I don't go back and I'm like, I said that wrong. It ranged from 1 to 6, 1 being I completely agree, and 6 being I completely disagree.
Okay.
So the statement was asked, students with emotional disabilities have the same education needs as other students. So teachers who work in gen ed, they mostly agreed, while as teachers who worked in a self-contained setting, they disagreed a little bit. And teachers who work in a self-contained setting, and I'm going to speak based on my experience, students with emotional disabilities have, I think, different needs than a lot of general education students. They need to feel important. They need to feel loved. Not that a lot of general education students don't need that, but a lot of students with emotional disabilities, they come from one-parent households. They come with a lot of baggage and a lot of obstacles that they have faced that I personally could never imagine facing and overcoming. And they have to carry that every day. So it's a little bit of different need you need to address when they come into the building.
It's like they need a little bit more compassionate approach, maybe is a way to say it.
Yeah. The next statement was many students with emotional disabilities are just as intelligent as students who don't have disabilities. So teachers who work in gen ed, they mostly agreed, while teachers who work in a self-contained setting completely agreed. I thought that was, it's close. I'm glad they were really close, but just a little bit off. And I think that goes down to like teachers who work in gen ed might not see them all the time as like the intelligence and as much as, you know.
Yeah, it's like you can't separate that. It's like you're bad, so you must not be good either. And I don't know why we think that, but I don't know, it's kind of there.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I was talking to one gen ed teacher and about this, and I think she expressed that sometimes she thinks the students who have the trauma and come off as bad aren't always in class. You know, they're roaming the halls or they are absent a lot. And sometimes teachers have expressed that they think like that impacts their intelligence.
Mm.
And I kind of responded, I said, yeah, I can see that. But also, you know, every student learns differently. And one student, you know, might only need one lesson and one exposure to get the concept.
Yeah.
And it, you know, you just don't know.
Yeah, I've been surprised over the years, the kids who sort of got in trouble, not all of them, I don't want to put them all in the same category, but it's been surprising that some coming out of that have been some of the brightest kids.
Yeah.
And if you can just find that and focus and highlight that, you might see those other behaviors diminish, or maybe they just need to learn a few skills to help them on that end.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. One of my students,
incredible for me.
Yeah. One of my students who I had, he taught himself calculus.
Wow.
At home because he was suspended, and he came back. He's like, hey, I figured out this. And I'm like, what? He goes, my mom took all my things, and you know, I had that math book, so I looked up this.
Wow.
I'm like, oh, okay. I'm like, oh, what is wrong with, like, what?
I know. I heard this statement once that kids with challenging behaviors are often grossly misunderstood. And the more I see in this area, I'm like, yeah, they're good. They go seek first to understand. Like, do you really understand what's like all about that kid? Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah. The next statement was, as an educator, it would be beneficial to collaborate daily with a special educator about how to create an inclusive environment for students with emotional disabilities. And again, like they're only off by 1 point, but
Yeah.
this one just kind of like got to my heart, because teachers who work in gen ed, they mostly agreed, while teachers who worked in a self-contained setting completely agreed.
We want it.
Yeah. And I think that
Such a big asset or an enemy to get.
Yeah.
hold of.
Yeah, well, because if a gen ed teacher, and when I say gen ed, I'm not trying to say all gen ed teachers, but I'm just,
Right.
if a general education teacher, or even, you know, any teacher, if they don't want to collaborate, there's really nothing you can do with, you know, if you, as a principal or as an administrator, as a supervisor, to say, okay, we're going to have this collaboration time.
Right.
But if they're not bought in,
Mhm.
they're really going to apply it, use it, be engaged.
Yeah. If there's no desire, you're kind of like shot in the foot.
Yeah.
Yeah. But that was encouraging to see that they do want it. If we can give them more time, let's try to provide that for them.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Which I think in Maryland, it was really nice. Not that COVID was nice, but when we were all at home and we didn't have Google Classroom figured out yet, and we were getting on Zoom, we were able, like a lot of teachers were more open to talking to me versus the previous years before.
Yeah.
There wasn't enough time when we were prepping for state testing, when
True.
we're doing, and it was really nice because they were asking me some of my stories and asking, you know, respond to that. And it was neat. And I think very simple, like it wasn't a, you know, a setup PD, but it was just nice to talk.
Right.
So then I compared roles. So I looked at general educators versus special educators. And so there's a statement made, teachers of children with emotional disabilities should be less strict than other teachers. General education teachers disagreed a little, where special education teachers mostly agreed. And when I followed up with some special education teachers about what being less strict looks like, they expressed that like less strict was more offering choices, like what we've already talked about, being compassionate, offering choices, letting the student feel like they have control when they really don't, but it's just words. Whereas like the general education teachers, when I ask them this, they're like, no, like all students have to have the same structure.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah. The next statement was, as an educator, it'd be beneficial, again, this is the same, to collaborate daily. And we had the same results, that general education teachers mostly agreed, while special education teachers completely agreed, which is nice because they do want to collaborate.
Yeah.
And it's definitely needed. And again, comparing roles, many students with emotional disabilities are just as intelligent as students who don't have disabilities. Both roles agreed, whereas just general education teachers mostly agreed, while special education teachers completely agreed.
Why do you think that is?
I think it just goes down to special education teachers get to work more one-on-one with students. And this is my, I haven't been a general education teacher, so, but based off my experience, I feel like we get to know the student more holistically since we have smaller classes. My coworkers, they have anywhere from 100 to 150 kids. And I can't imagine getting to know the kids on a, like, you know, all 150 kids on a deep level. Like I would be, if I was a general education teacher that attempted that task, I would be physically and mentally like drained every day.
Yeah.
And not saying that it's not worth it to do that, but I think that's just that huge, you know, the bigger classes.
Yeah.
The next statement was, most students with emotional disabilities feel sorry for themselves, which this made me happy because they both disagreed. They didn't completely disagree, but they disagreed a little. And at first I was like, I wonder why they disagreed a little bit. And then when talking to people and me thinking about my experiences, I was like, yeah, I think sometimes they do get stuck in like the, oh man, like I have this label, or, oh man, I have an IEP, or, oh, I go home and my life is hard. And like, it is like all those statements are true. But I think that some of the students do get stuck in that mindset, instead of thinking that they can make honor roll and focusing on honor roll, they just think of their label.
Yeah.
Which I think that if teachers really get to know the student holistically and like, have the conversations that we talked about before, that this statement hopefully could change.
Yeah, I believe it. Yeah, I hope so.
So one thing that I asked, this is where the 40 came in. One thing that I asked, I gave out the survey, and then I was like, oh, I didn't ask this question. So I informally asked 40 teachers that in your undergrad or Master's of Education prep, did you take any coursework or have any discussion about students with emotional disabilities? 22% had, and 78% had never had any prior coursework.
Wow, that's alarming.
Yeah. In the 9 teachers that said yes, one of them actually specified their special education major and students with emotional disabilities.
Okay.
So that was really cool to pick her brain and talk to her. And she even expressed, like, when she was in her undergrad and getting this specific major, that people would refer to her as crazy, that she wanted to help these kids that,
Wow, that's something.
Yeah. So I'm going to continue. So I talked about the interview already a little bit. That the student is amazing.
That was really good. Yeah.
Awesome. And then what I found, I'm going to answer these two guys really quick, is that the current attitudes towards students with emotional disabilities in the gen ed classroom is that they're initially judged. 2 out of 30 participants expressed that they do not think that students with emotional disabilities should be in the general education setting. Teachers did express in the gen ed setting that they are using different interventions, but they also are using similar interventions with students without emotional disabilities. The majority of the general education staff wrote in open-ended questions that they would really like additional training.
Yeah.
Going again, talking about like the conversations that I had over Zoom with my coworkers during COVID, a lot of them expressed that they wanted to talk about like more positive moments being shared. So like talking about like, the self-contained teachers expressing that like I did this and this, and the result was the student increasing their reading level by 2. The student used to be verbally aggressive, and now the student says yes ma'am and no ma'am. Stuff like that they really want to hear, and they feel like that would make them more open, have a better mindset to working with these students.
I like what one educator was sharing recently to our staff, that each teacher writes a little 3x5 card of all of the strengths of the child.
Yes.
Like across areas, like not just academically, but including academically. And then those cards were passed to the next year's teacher, because sometimes you just only know of the not so great things happening with, certain individuals, but everybody had like a little leg up the next year to start with. Isn't that cool?
I like that. I'll tell my principal that. I like that a lot. I think that's,
because you're right. It's sometimes, and just it naturally, I think as humans, we just think of the negative, or your brain like, oh no. I mean, when you look back at your day, what always stands out is the thing that didn't happen. Like we're just somehow just wired and trained to just like think of the pessimistic part of everything, right?
yes.
So now you just have to plan for the opposite and give them reasons to see how amazing and beautiful and wonderful those individuals are, no matter what struggles that they have, because they're not robots. They're not going to be perfect.
Yeah, no, and I really like that card. And I think when you said the word plan, I used to, when I got new students for the incoming year, I would look at all their referral history, and I would look at their behavior plans that they have in place, and look at and like study the IEP. And unfortunately, a lot of in the IEP is a lot of negative, you know?
Yeah.
This picture of this kid, because I was like, okay, I need to plan, you know, if they need a break area, you know, but
Yeah.
that becomes really overwhelming because you're seeing all these referrals, like there's no positive referrals
Yeah. Right.
in the system. Like,
Right.
so I think that I like those cards a lot. I think
That's our positive referral system. I like that. We're going to create that, Emily. Let's do it.
I think you should. I think it would just paint such a better picture of students than.
Yeah. And sometimes they like, there was something I read a post the other day, like your child, how they are today is not who they're going to be in the future. Like we can change that trajectory where that kid's going to end up. It doesn't have to be that bad kid that we kind of all know them to be. So I don't know. That's what I'm on a mission for.
Yeah. I think I heard this analogy and I think it's like perfect thinking about just like kids and just like unknowns because you can't plan everything. But like, I really think that some students are like, you take an 1,000-piece puzzle out, you dump it out and you don't have the picture to put it together.
Oh, wow. That's cool.
And you just have to like, and you know, one day you'll have a corner and then some days you'll be like, that's not right. And you have to tear it apart and put it back together because you don't have the guide to look at, you know?
Yeah.
So in comparing the attitudes of the outside general education teachers, the MEs and the county, they really emphasize on learning about the student's unique behaviors and how to best support him and her. So going back to what we just talked about, looking at those like referrals and thinking about how to support them, but also that can become overwhelming because you're like, oh, wow, this kid's a biter. Like, how am I going to prepare, you know, to not bite?
Right.
The other thing that they really talked about in their open-ended questions was that they believe that students with ED are just as capable as peers without disabilities, which I think that's like really awesome, really, really awesome to enforce. And I really think that like that bleeds onto like your students as well.
Yes, I agree.
And that if they also really talked about social and emotional needs need to be addressed as well as academic needs. And I didn't see that verbiage as much in the general education responses. It was more about the academics and thinking, you know, getting the test scores in and that they don't have time to deal with these behaviors because they have all this pressure from their supervisor to get the scores and meet. In Maryland, we have things called SLOs. And so to meet these goals, these individual goals that each teacher has to write like an SLO that they start and they say, okay, 70% of my students are going to pass the end of the term test.
Yeah.
And I have to send all this data off to the state to show this growth. And that's really, that can become really stressful.
Right. And it's the pressure that they're driven under.
Yeah. Instead of thinking, you know, they're thinking about that and not the social and emotional needs. Yeah. And the last thing is that they really express like the need to collaborate and talk.
Yeah, I think that's so important. Yeah. So much more time. This has to be built in for that.
Yeah. And I think that, and I know as an educator, I'm constantly like, okay, I only have 30 minutes. I need to get my list done and like into a zone. And I don't like when people come in my classroom during my planning, I'm like, please get out. Like, I don't have, you know, this is not your time right now. But I think that like being comfortable with being unstructured and not having a task list, I think that could go a really long way in helping students.
Yeah, and as administrators, providing that time for your staff to collaborate.
Yes. Yeah. And that was proven with this question. I mean, one of the possible solutions was additional training. One thing that everyone was talking about is that they really hope that at the college level, like at undergraduate and graduate level, they like, you know, talk about this with classes.
Yeah. I hope they do include more and more.
Yeah, I think they should. I mean, I didn't know when I was an undergrad, we had one miniature conversation about students with emotional disabilities. That was it.
Yeah, I don't think there's a lot out there. And then as educators, you don't feel like you're an expert in the area. And so when you get a kid who acts out, we really feel at a loss.
Yeah.
But yet we're looked to have the answer. And it's embarrassing that sometimes we don't have the answer.
Okay.
So maybe this will be a good call for more research, more training.
Yes. No, I agree. And I think that's it because I addressed that one.
So what was one of your biggest takeaways?
I think my biggest takeaway was that it made me, I think during my 4 years of teaching, I'm my biggest critic. And I think most teachers are, because they want to do the right thing and they want to have success. They want, they want to feel like they're just doing the right thing and not going to work every day and emptying a boat that's sinking. And I think during my 4 years of teaching students with emotional disabilities, I was always like, why don't I have the answer for this? I don't feel like I'm servicing this kid correctly. I don't feel like I'm doing it right. And I think this whole research project just kind of was like a breath of fresh air, because I'm like, no, and I don't, there is no answer. The only answer and the only concrete research is that these kids are probably not going to pass high school or be successful in the adult life, and which gave me more motivation. I feel like for the rest of the school year, everyone's like, why are you so peppy? Why are you so nice? And I'm like, because literally in my head, I was like, I don't want kids to go.
I got to make this difference.
Yeah, like it just was in my head. Like I was like, this is the only thing that works. So this is the only thing I can do. And I just felt a lot more effective. And I felt like I was patching a hole instead of like getting the water out.
So listening more, taking the time to listen. I think they say a kid needs 7 connections to someone in school to really help them through, and just like, just 7 people showing an interest, connecting with them. How was your weekend? Acknowledging them, making them feel valued, wanted, needed. I have a place, like I showed up and someone noticed me today. Like if we just kept that in our mind as we interacted and went throughout our day interacting with kids. And I love, even a kindergarten teacher did an assessment survey with her kids, just checking in with them. Like, how do you feel in class? Do you feel like I give you choices? Do you like something so simple, but you could do this and just tailor it for every grade, and getting that feedback mid-year really helps you reflect like what, and she thought she was giving them a lot of choice. And 90% of them were like, we don't feel like we have a choice when we come into the classroom. She was like, what? So it's amazing what we think we're doing, and yet what's really, really going on, or what they're thinking and feeling. And I think you married that really beautifully for us to think about.
Yeah. One thing I want to add on that is that, like, to teachers, like, just because you ask them how they're doing and you talk to them and you think like you're being bubbly, don't expect them to be bubbly back. Don't have expectations of what the conversation's going to look like, because you might miss something when you're expecting how that conversation's going to go. Just being open to one thing my student said when we were talking about these, conversations of engagement, she's like, they need to be offered, but you shouldn't expect them to engage. And I was like, okay. And she's like, but you still need to offer them every day.
Wow. That's really good.
Yeah. So.
Well, thank you so much. This was
Thank
really
you for
special
having me on.
to hear about, what you researched, what you looked into, how you reflected on your own practice and changed what you did. And I know those kids that you interacted with this year are, I know that you made that difference for them in these little adjustments that you made. And I love that we can come back to this interview and just be rejuvenated and recharged and like reminded of these great skills and practices to use when we're connecting with the kids, and don't assume, and seek first to understand, and find out from them, ask them, just ask.
Yep.
Give them the two choices that you're okay with.
Yes. Yeah. Not something that you can't do.
Battle you do not want to fight.
I think my favorite one was my co-teacher's like, okay, you can go take a break, or you can go on a walk, or you can I forget what she said, something else, but she didn't have an assistant to go take the student on a walk. And I was like, well, that student can't go on a walk now.
I know. And then you look at it, you're like, no, you just offered it, but now I can't do that. I can't choose that choice you just gave me.
Yeah. And then they're like, what? But yeah.
Well, Emily, thank you for all the kids' lives that you impact and being an inspiration to the educators and colleagues, not only in your school and district, but to all those who are going to end up listening to this interview. Thank you so much. And I know there's a lot that you and educators give and give and give, and you don't always hear the thank you and the difference that you made. So for the times you haven't, and I just want to encourage you to keep on doing what you're doing, because you're making a difference and the world needs more people like you. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you for having me on.
You're welcome.
Well, that's all we've got for this episode of the Momnificent podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, I would be honored if you would subscribe and rate if you really liked it. I know wherever you're listening right now, it might not be the best time to leave a comment, but feel free to leave a question, a review, or a comment at any time. And until next time, remember, don't worry, be happy.